we haven't spoken a lot about this since the murder of Mahsa Amini back in September. And since then, there has been an intense crackdown on dissent. The state has come down in terms of disappearances, murders, executions, and repression. So tell us what's going on now, and what your sense of the situation on the ground is for those who have not been following.
Sure. So let me give a recap and then I'll talk about now. In September, as most of your viewers probably know, a young Kurdish woman by the name of Mahsa Amini was visiting from a small town in the Kurdish region. She was visiting Tehran, the capital, with her family. She gets arrested outside a metro for wearing improper hijab, taken to custody of the quote-unquote morality police, or literally the guidance patrol, as they call themselves, Gasht Ershad, and dies in their custody, essentially murdered. And then the state immediately starts to reject the fact that this was essentially a death and murder, or a murder in their custody, put out these alternative stories that she had underlying health conditions, which her family has denied. And to refute essentially violence by this morality police, which has been documented and witnessed by many, many women over the past years. And so we saw an eruption of protests, initially against the morality police hijab, and then with very basically radical slogans against the entirety of the system, and no to the ruling elite, to the entirety of the Islamic Republic in the past few months.
Yeah.
With women and young girls leading these protests, essentially a feminist uprising, and with people risking their lives when they go to the streets to protest. So far, human rights organizations have documented over 500 protesters killed. Thousands were arrested. A number of them have been released. At least 4 protesters were executed by the state in very fast sham trials, again, as human rights organizations have called it. And basically, the state has used an iron fist to repress and to crack down on these women-led protests. And they have slowed down as far as the number of people we see on the street, but they also continue in other forms of civil disobedience and defiance. Just this week, my friend Fanos Fassi had a report out in the New York Times about how women are increasingly showing up in public without the hijab, even in official settings, which is essentially a defiance of the law, and the reason why Masa Amini is dead now. So the dissent continues. The anger, the grievances, the opposition, the protest, but the state has also really used violence and brutality to crack down on many of these protesters.
Yeah, and I think it's incredible though. In the beginning, right, there seemed to be like the Republic was scared that there was a little bit of fear because the protests were really catching on, like you said, led by women, but truly, and about this issue, but truly became about everything, became about the government as a whole, right? And the iron fist in just generally living your life. So initially, I remember, and I'm not sure if this held, that the morality police, so-called, was disbanded. Did that stay? Did that stick? And has anything actually shifted, or is it just been pure repression?
So that was sort of a complex news that came out of Iran, with the judiciary figures saying there is no morality police because it had been rebranded recently and sort of restructured under which force it goes. And protesters had been reporting seeing less of this morality police because they were seeing riot gear and riot forces. So
Right.
Police were out in like arms and on full riot gear to essentially crack down on the protests. But what's important, regardless of whether the morality police or this guidance patrol is around or not, or how long that will hold, they're trying to enforce it in other forms. So you would get an alert on your phone, a threatening SMS that you had been driving on the street without your hijab on, so here's a fine for you. If you're a business, businesses had been closed or threatened to be closed if they had employees without the hijab, or worse, if they served customers. There's a case of a bank, now drugstores. So the state has also these other sort of tools in our toolbox to enforce this mandatory hijab law, even if it's not necessarily through the morality police. It's also with the weather. Usually people report seeing more of this morality police during the summer, where women naturally wear less clothes, and as it gets colder in the winter, women put on bigger coats, you see less of that. So there's multiple different factors, but they haven't backed down, meaning the state hasn't really backed down, and they've doubled down and really just responded to these protests with violence and with brutality.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess my question is in terms of like political leadership, right? Like, what are the openings when it comes to whether this is trickling, the uprising is actually touching the republic at all? I mean, I am assuming there's no, I mean, this is a country without opposition, without, like a democratic elections. So who is allowed to take up the mantle of leadership without getting assassinated, if at all? Are there any openings there, or is this just, no, this is about a latent Arab Spring that is coming to Iran? I mean, it has before with the Green Revolution and so on, and I know this is part of a long history of struggle, but yeah, I guess I'm just asking, like, where do you think this movement energy now goes?
So you mentioned the Green Movement back in 2009. The top leaders of that movement have been in house arrest since then. Also, leaders of the opposition outside the country live in exile. They can't travel back to Iran. So, like you're saying, there isn't really a vibrant and, official opposition inside the country. And many figures, social, political figures who show any form of leadership, many women, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Narges Mohammadi, are also either in prison or get constantly threatened for showing this kind of leadership of the movement. So, it's very difficult to say. The state has shown very little flexibility, but at the same time, the reaction to the protests, as you're saying, indicates their fear of these protesters. They're clearly dealing with a crisis of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Whether that crisis of legitimacy, meaning people or a big part of the society not wanting them, would that translate into a crisis of an existential crisis? That's hard to say, because the state also has a monopoly on arms, on power, on violence. These protesters go out with bare hands. They essentially put their lives on the line, their bodies, and they're met with various different levels of force and violence. But the legitimacy crisis is serious. Even when I hear from a lot of sources and people I speak to on the ground, when they can't go on the street, when the street gets too dangerous, people start chanting from the rooftops, or they go out on the balcony at night chanting "Death to the dictator" or "No to the Islamic Republic." So the defiance remains, the grievances remain, dissent remains, but how it can be portrayed and seen, especially by us from the outside, is different. But the state also definitely does feel that they have a legitimacy crisis at hand. And I also want to reiterate, the morality police or this mandatory hijab law is not only about the covering. Yes, the dress code is the most up forward and visible sign of it, but women also are treated unequally in many other aspects when it comes to the state and law, in marriage, in divorce, child custody, even in the workplace. So they're dealing with these levels of discrimination in their private and professional life. And essentially, this is a continuation of a century-long struggle of vibrant women's movement that has been standing up not just to this state and this issue of politics, but also core roots of patriarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know reports, sort of suspicious poisonings of schoolgirls trying to just get an education, and they have been fallen ill. Do we know what's going on in that with that?
Well, it's been reported in multiple schools, and essentially they were trying to say that it's an accident, but it just kept recurring. And just today, I saw reporting by some officials. There was a conversation in the parliament by some officials that's suggesting that it's being done deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very clear who is doing it. Obviously, if it's happening in girls' schools, it's forces, fundamentalists, possibly forces that have a problem with girls being in school, getting an education.
Yeah.
It's also important to note that women and girls, meaning school children, high schoolers, some even younger, have been a part of the force leading this feminist uprising. So it's all part of that big package, again, as I said, of this state-sanctioned discrimination, patriarchy that's gotten really violent, trying to put women in their place, who dare to speak up, who dare to protest, who dare to dress as they like, and who dare to get an education.
I guess I wanted to ask, because even though it is this is the hand and the work of a very patriarchal state, anti-democratic patriarchal state, you're saying, like you've been saying, this is more than just, this is a feminist movement that many people have been involved in. So men have also been, very active and in solidarity with the women, which I think is just shows you how out of step the Islamic Republic is with their own people, number one. But also I think it's surprising and inspiring for the world at large to see that this is a feminist uprising that it has so many people involved in it, that it isn't just the women on their own.
Certainly, women and allies, I should say, women, girls, and allies. Obviously, women and girls were the ones leading it. The spark of the protest is a women's rights issue, is a woman who died or was murdered in custody because of how she was dressed, and many other women identified with that because that's how they dress when they go out and about with their lives. But definitely women and allies, and we've seen an intersectional community of protesters. So Masa Amini was a Kurdish woman, belonged to an ethnic religious minority in an impoverished area of Iran. They have many of their own grievances against the central government, and the protests essentially broke out initially in her hometown of Saqqez and across the Kurdish region of Iran. In Baluchistan, again, another ethnic minority, there has been ongoing protests. Even when you don't see as many people out in big cities, in Baluchistan and Kurdistan, protests have continued. And we've seen an intersectional community of university students, teachers, nurses, laborers, oil workers went on strike. So many different segments of the society bringing their own grievances, but also overlapping in their resistance to the current political, economic, and social structure.
We need some of that here. Like, we need, like if the women of Iran can do this, then the women of the United States sure as shit need to do this. We're, as we face our own, religious right as well, trying to police our bodies. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.